Hi everyone, hope all of you can hear me. Can someone please ping on the chat? Okay, great. Okay. So thanks for joining in. I'm Prabhas Sirivardhana from WSO2. Hope all of you are doing good and staying safe. So this is our third IAM for developer meetup, and so we have done two before. So one on JWT and the other one on Istio. The next week, we are planning to do another one on securing access to single page apps with OO2O and OpenID Connect. So if you hear about WSO2 for the first time, it's a company which produces a set of open source products, all released under the Apache 2.0 license. We have an identity server, so that's the product I lead. And also we have an API manager and an enterprise integrator. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. All of you are muted now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute and speak up, or else you can use the Zoom chat to raise any questions. Okay, so to set the expectations right from this session, I won't expect you to know OO2O in detail, in depth, but probably it's better if you have some experience in using OO2 at least and heard of OO2. That's enough. We'll start with basics, and then we'll talk about the internals and then the applications. At any point, if you have any questions, feel free to raise them. Okay, so this is the definition of the OO2, which I directly copied from the OO2 RFC. I won't expect you to read this. And then again, OO2 and RFC came out from the OAuth working group under IETF. The takeaway from this slide is OAuth2O is an authorization framework which is for access delegation. So that's the most simplest definition of OAuth2O. Okay. So let's see how it works. So there are four main actors in an OAuth2O flow. The client application, the authorization server, resource server, and the resource owner. So I'll explain this with a practical example. Let's say you have an Instagram account, right? So you have the Instagram app installed in your mobile device. Then you want to publish some of your Instagram photos to your Facebook wall, right? So in that use case, your Instagram app is the OAuth client. Then Facebook plays two roles here. Facebook acts as the authorization server as well as the resource server, right? So you are the resource owner who owns the Facebook account, right? Now for Instagram to publish a photo from your Instagram account to your Facebook wall, if it follows the OAuth protocol, first Instagram has to talk to the Facebook authorization server and get a token with your consent, right? So basically you will be redirected to a Facebook authorization server, and in that request itself, Instagram will ask from Facebook, I need a token to publish a photo to the authorization server, right? So then to the resource server or the Facebook wall. Then authorization server will get your consent. So you need to authenticate to the authorization server, which is Facebook, and give your consent. So then with your consent, Facebook will create a temporary token and will share that token with Instagram. And then Instagram will use that token to access the Facebook API and publish photos to your Facebook wall. And that particular token is only good enough to publish photos to your Facebook wall. It cannot do anything other than that. It cannot use that token to read your friend list, read your Facebook chat, and do anything else other than just publishing photos. And then again, it has a lifetime. So once the token expires, OAuth can't do anything else without getting your consent, right? So this is the whole concept behind OAuth. And here you can see the delegation use case here is the client application accesses your Facebook wall on behalf of you, right? So Facebook wall or the Facebook API is a resource server. Facebook itself is the authorization server which authenticates you and issues a token to the client application. Okay? So you are the resource owner. To implement this, OAuth has defined four grant flows, right? So some people call it grant types, but I would rather call them grant flows. It's much cleaner because within the grant flow, you can use a grant type, right? So a grant flow in O2 defines the flow or the protocol, how a client application can get an access token to access a resource on behalf of an end user, right? So the most common grant type is authorization code grant type. So in addition to authorization code grant type, OAuth has defined, OAuth RFC has defined 3 more grant types: implicit grant type, resource owner grant type, or the password grant type, and then the client credentials grant type. So we'll go through all of those as well. So this is how the authorization code grant type works. Like 95% of the OAuth applications that you see, they use authorization code grant type. So this is how it works. So this is your client application. So it can be the Instagram app. Now, when the client application wants to get a token to access a resource on behalf of you, in step 1, you'll be redirected to the authorization server, right? So the redirection goes through the browser. So you get redirected to the authorization server. Then authorization server will prompt you to authenticate, and also will get your consent, and also will let you know this particular client wants to access your resource to do these actions, right? So what the purpose of this request, the purpose of this token, the client has to communicate in this request in step 1 to the authorization server, right? So the client has to tell authorization server, I want this token to publish photos to Facebook wall. Then authorization server will communicate that to the resource owner, get the consent of the resource owner, and then we'll share a temporary code with the OAuth client application, right? So this is called the authorization code. Once again, it flows to the browser. So when anything flows to the browser, the resource owner can see, right? The end user can see it. So this is a one-time code with a very short expiration time. So ideally, it's around 30 seconds to 1 minute. Now, the OAuth client application has the code. In step 4, it will exchange that code to an access token, right? So now you get an access token, and the client application can use that access token to access a resource or Facebook API. When you get the access token along with the API request, the authorization is the resource server will intercept the request. So probably in practice, you will use an API gateway here. You intercept the request, extract out the OAuth access token from the request, and will talk to the authorization server or the issuer of the token to validate the token. If the token is valid, and if the token carries a purpose which is good enough for the action the client application is performing, the resource server will let that request execute, right? So that's how OAuth works at a high level, the authorization code grant type, right? So a couple of things here. When the client has to register with the authorization server first, right? So when you send the first request to the authorization server, you also need to send something called client ID, right? So looking at the client ID, authorization server can identify who the client is, right? So it's a client ID. Then in step 3, when authorization server redirects the user to the client application, it is redirecting the user to a URL which is known to the authorization server before. So that means OAuth client has to register, we call it redirect URL, or else the callback URL with the authorization server, right? So that's the second point. Then the other one is in step 4, when the client application exchanges the code to the access token, client has to authenticate itself to the authorization server. So in most of the time, you will use a client ID and a secret. But then again, in OAuth specification, authenticating the client in step 4 is not mandatory. So it's optional. And also, even if you authenticate the client, you don't need to use client ID and client secret all the time. You can use much stronger authentication mechanisms to like MTLS to authenticate the client, right? So that's a high level overview. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Then, so it's the same thing we discussed before in a different view, right? the grant type here is only from step 1 to step 5, right? So number 6 is not in the grant type, right? So grant type only talks about how a client application gets a token from the end user. So once you have the grant type, that's it. How you access the resource, it's outside the OAuth grant type. So then again, it's common across all the grant types. You get the access token, you add that to the authorization header, and then you invoke the API, right? It's common across all the grant types. So this is how it works internally. So this is a sequence diagram. Now we have the browser. This is a client application, authorization server. You do a get from the browser. You basically type the client app URL. Then the client will, if user is not authenticated at the client, if user doesn't have valid session with the client will send a 302 response to the browser, right? So when you send a 302, you also add something as a location header, right? So the location header in the 302 response will point to the authorized endpoint of the authorization server, right? So then it goes to the browser, then browser will send the user to the authorization server, right? So in the first request, you send something called response type. And if you're using authorization code grant type, you must set it to code, right? So you always send response type to the authorized endpoint, right? So there are two endpoints in the authorization server, two main endpoints in authorization server. That's the authorized endpoint and the token endpoint. Response type parameter, you always send only to the authorized endpoint. So here you send response type as code. Response type here means what are the tokens I expect back from the authorized server. So here when I say response type is code, that means I'm expecting a code from the authorized endpoint. So there are other values too, right? In addition to response type, so there's another parameter called response mode, right? Response type defines what tokens you need. Response mode defines how you expect these tokens. Like for example, authorization server can send these tokens in the query string. And you can send, the authorization server can send these parameters or the tokens as a URL fragment or else in a form post. You can request those under the response mode too. Response mode is optional. And for any given response type, there's a default response mode as well. For the response type code, the default response mode is query string, right? So that means authorization server will send authorization code in a query string, right? So here the request goes to the authorization server. Authorization server will check whether there's a valid session for the end user. If no valid session, then it will do a 200 response to the browser that will display the login page, and probably you will get the user's consent. Then that will be posted to the authorization server from the browser. Then authorization server will generate a code, and once again will do a 302, right? So when you do a 302 with the code, it goes to the browser first, right? So the code goes as a query string in the location header along with the callback URL or the redirect URI pointing to the application. So it goes to the browser, then browser will extract out the location header which points to the client application and will send that to the client. Now client will extract out the code from the response it got from the browser, and then we'll do a call to the authorization server's token endpoint. So you pass the code, and here you also need to set the grant type as authorization code. So if you are using authorization code grant type, you must use authorization code as the grant type parameter. So then again, the grant type parameter always goes to the token endpoint, while response type parameter always goes to the code, right? The authorization code flow, it defines the entire thing, right? So how you get the token, what's the response type parameter should be, it defines the entire flow, right? So authorization, the grant type, but it only goes to the token endpoint of the authorization server. So this will validate the authorization code, and if you pass client ID and client secret in this request, it will also authenticate the client application. If everything looks good, it will issue the token, right? So this call, you can see it never goes to the browser, but the code always goes to the browser, right? So this is how the authorization code grant type works internally. Okay. So there are few like important parameters like scope, then state parameters. So we'll discuss those stuff later. Now let's see how this works in practice. So I'm using WSO2 Identity Server, which is an open source product. As the authorization server, you can use any other open source product too. So once you download it, it's around 350 distribution. You only need to have Java 8 plus set up, or Java 11. We supported the latest version. Then you can log in as admin to the management console. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a client application in IIS. So we call it the service providers. You can add the service provider here. I already have done that. So I'll show you my service provider. So this is a curl app. So what I'm going to show is like, I'm not going to show you like a flow happening through a web app. I'm going to show you all the raw messages. So I'm only using curl here, right? Now let's edit the curl app. So you can think about this curl app as the Instagram, right? So here then I need to expand inbound authentication configuration. So Identity Server supports multiple protocols: OpenID Connect, WS Federation, CAS, and SAML. Here, since I'm going to configure OpenID Connect, I need to expand this one. Click Edit. So here you can see all the grant types supported by this product. And I need to specify a callback URL, right? Or else redirect URL. So this is the URL the authorization server will use to send the authorization code back to the client, right? So here I have put HTTPS curl app. So this URL doesn't exist. There's no service running in my machine listening to this one. So you will see the exact flow. So when the authorization server returns back the code to this particular URL, it will stay on the browser location bar, right? Address bar. So then you can just copy it from there and use it in curl. The other stuff are like implementation specific, not specified in the OAuth spec. So different IDPs, different authorization servers, they follow their own approach. So here you can see in Identity Server, you can configure all like expiration times. Even you can configure how you want to issue this token, either as a opaque reference token or else as a JWT self-contained access token. So we'll talk about those stuff later. So now I have the service provider. So once I create the service provider, I will get a client ID and a client secret. Right? This is a client ID and client secret. I need to copy this and paste this into my curl client. Right? So here you can see, okay, so I am using a file called environment.sh. I think it's not here. So here you can see I have a file called environment.sh. So this has all the parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm putting all the configuration parameters here and then source this file. Here you can see the token endpoint of the identity server, the authorized endpoint of the identity server, and also the client ID and client secret, which I copied from the service provider configuration. Okay. Now, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate the request the client application has to initiate during the login flow, right? So when you go to Instagram and click login, it will generate a similar request, right? So let me do that. Okay. So this is the request, right? So this is the request. I need to copy and paste it on my browser. So then the user will get redirected to the identity server. So here you can see I specify my client ID, this application client ID, and scope. So we'll talk about scope later, and the redirect URL. So this should be the same URL I specified in identity server or the authorization server at the time I create this app. Okay? And the response type is set to code. Right? Because I'm using authorization code, the response type must be code. I copy this URL, go to the browser. Let me get a private browser. So here, this request will start when you click on login on your client application, right? So this takes me to the identity server login page. I can log in with a user there. Then I got to redirect to the client app, right? This is the curl app or the URL pointing to my app, right? Now, if you look at the diagram, we are here. If you look at this diagram, we are here. We have finished step 3. So the client app got the authorization code, right? So if you have a real app behind this, then the app itself will get this code. Now what I will do is I copy this code, right, and go back to my curl app. So I'll export this as code. Now I need to perform step 4. I need to exchange this authorization code to an access token. To do that, I am using this script id token.sh. If you look at this, you can see I'm passing the client ID and client secret to authenticate my client app to the authorization server. Then I'm also passing the authorization code I got from the previous step. Then the grant type is set as authorization code. Then the client ID, redirect URI. So this redirect URI must match the redirect URI that this app registered in the authorization server already, right? Okay, so let me run this command. So now I got an access token, right? Along with the access token, I also got a refresh token, right? So it's not mandatory for the authorization server to return a refresh token. But if you have a refresh token, what you can do is before the access token expires, the client application can refresh your access token or get a new access token, right? Without any involvement of the end user, right? Otherwise, you need to once again initiate the login flow, get the user's consent, and then get the access token. But if you have a refresh token, you can keep on refreshing your access token, and refresh token has its lifetime too. Here you specify under the expires in parameter, right, the lifetime of this particular token. So this is in seconds, right? So here it says 143 seconds, right? So this is a lifetime of the access token. Then, so there are 2 ways people follow to validate the lifetime of an access token before using it. One way is before you using this access token to access an API, you can see whether this token has expired, right? So, but then again, this just specifies like this token will expire after this number of seconds, right? This doesn't say just right after this time this will expire. So this is just an indication. You need to see whether the token is expired. The other approach is you won't check the expires in parameter before you use, you just keep using it. If the gateway or the resource server sends you back a response saying the token has expired, at that point you can refresh a token by talking to the authorization server's token endpoint, right? Okay. And other things, scope parameter, right? So if you go back to this diagram here, in step 1, when the authorization, when the client application requesting a token from the authorization server, it also has to specify the purpose of this token. The purpose of this token is specified under the parameter called scope, right? So I need this token for this particular scope, right? Then the value of the scope should be known to the authorization server, resource server, and the client application, all 3. For example, like if you go back to the Instagram example, if the client application wants to publish photos to the Facebook wall, then you have Facebook API, right? So then Facebook API, if you look at the Facebook API documentation, you can specify if someone wants to do a post or a put to the Facebook wall, then you need to bring a token with publish to wall scope. It's just a string, right? Then the client knows if it has to invoke this API, it should have a token under publish to wall scope. Then when client requests a token from the authorization server, you will send that scope parameter along with the request, saying I need a token with the scope publish to wall. then the authorization server can do an access control check there to see whether the corresponding user, the resource owner, can issue a token under that particular scope, right? You can do an access control check. So you can see whether this user is in particular role who can issue a token under publish to all scope, or else you can attach a policy to that, right? So whatever the way, it's up to the authorization server to do any access control check. Then once you do that access control check, you can issue the code under that particular scope. Now, when the client uses that token to access access an API, you send that access token, then resource server will talk to authorization server and will check whether the token is valid, and also will find out the scope of this particular token. Now, the resource server, like once you found the scope associated with this token, resource server will check whether can this token be used to perform this particular action, right? So if you are trying to do read friend list with a token with the scope published to wall, resource server will reject that, right? So that's how the scope works. And in the request, you can in the request one, you can ask for multiple scopes as well. So then again, when you exchange this token code to an access token in step 4, you also need to specify the same set of scopes you requested in the first request, right? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. You don't need to specify the scope parameters in the request to the token endpoint, right? You only need to specify the scope parameters in the token to the authorized in the request to the authorized endpoint. Okay, so let's see a practical example. Let's see how Instagram users OAuth to authenticate you against Facebook, right? So let's try to log into Instagram. Let's use. So now I'm on Instagram, and I'll enable the developer tools. So now I want to log in here. I can click on login with Facebook, and now the Instagram will initiate the authorization request. So that's the same thing we did with our earlier client, right? Let me click here. So now I'm on Facebook. Now if you look at this request, so this is the authorization code request, which goes to the authorized endpoint of Facebook. Let me copy this one. And let's paste it here. Here you can see the client ID. This is the client ID of the Instagram app. So you need to register Instagram app with Facebook first, and then you got this client ID. Then redirect URI. So this has to be registered with Facebook as well. So this is the callback URL where Facebook will send the authorization code back to the Instagram. Then state parameter. So we'll talk about this later. In brief, if you send any value in the state parameter in this authorization request to the authorization server must send the same value back in the state parameter along with the authorization code to the application, right? In OAuth specification, use of state parameter is optional, but in practice, in terms of better security, you must use state parameter, right? So we'll discuss a practical use of state parameter in a later slide. Then you have the scope parameter, right? So this says I need a token under this particular scope, right? So here the scope is email, and the value of the scope should be interpreted by Facebook or the authorization server. Then the response type, right? So if we are using authorization code, you must use code as the response type, right? So response type, once again, it defines what tokens you need from the authorized server. Here you can see Instagram uses two response types. One is code, the other one is granted scopes. Right? So granted scope is not defined in the OAuth specification, something Facebook has defined. It's if you look at the Facebook documentation, you can find out the meaning of the granted scope response type. So in any way, if you specify any response type, the authorized server should know how to interpret that, and based on that, will decide what tokens it has to return back to the callback URL. Right? Let me show you the Facebook documentation on that. Should go here. So this is Facebook documentation on the granted scope parameter. So here you can see these are the response types supported by Facebook. So this is the granted scope. Right? Now let's try to authenticate to Facebook and see what a response you get. So I'll take this window to the other monitor and log in. I also need to use TOTP. Okay, I logged into Facebook. And now I am on Instagram, so I will show you this to you. So I am on Instagram now. Now, if you look at this message, you will see the response from Facebook. Let me copy this one. And paste it here. So this is a response from the Facebook, which goes to the redirect URL of the callback URL of the Instagram, right? Here you can see this URL here. It matches with the URL we sent here. Redirect URL. That's the same URL. And you get the code. So this is the authorization code parameter, right? So now, since we set granted scopes as a response type, in a response you will see the granted scopes, right? And also you will see something called denied scope, right? So that means if you specify the response type as granted scope, you will also get the granted scopes and denied scope. And here you can see the state parameter. So this is the same state parameter Instagram specified in the request. It's exactly the same, right? Okay. So any questions up to now? Okay. Okay. So here, so this is how an IDP mix-up attack happens, right? A given web application on its login page can have multiple login options, right? For example, if you look at this one, Medium, for example, so if you go to Medium login page, so if you go to Medium login page and click, okay, let me sign out and click sign in, you will see multiple login options, right? So each of these login options point to a different identity provider. In this case, in the IDP mix-up attack, so you will have a application like Medium, which has multiple login options, right? One login option could point to an IDP called foo, another login option could point to an IDP called evil, right? So this is how IDP mix-up attack happens. The first, the victim, the user, visits this application and click on the login option foo, right? So you have the application web page. You click on foo IDP in step 1. Now the browser will post that selection to the client application. Number 2 is out of the scope of OAuth 2, right? OAuth 2 doesn't like talk about how to pass these login options to the client application. Now let's say this is this is done over HTTP, right? Then anyone in the middle, an attacker in the middle, can intercept this request and can change the user selection from foo IDP to evil IDP, right? So even if we use TLS here, still like, so TLS secured, but we have seen in the past, like, so there are issues, there are bugs discovered in TLS, like Google and many other TLS related bugs, right? So someone can use such a vulnerability and to intercept this TLS channel too. Somehow we expect attacker to change the option, the login option user pick from foo IDP to evil IDP. Now the client application thinks user has picked evil IDP and it will do a 302. So remember the 302 coming from the OAuth client to the browser and then go to the authorization server. So you send this request in step 3. In the location header, it will point to the evil IDP's authorized endpoint. Then again, the attacker will intercept this request too and will update the location header to point to the foo IDP's authorization endpoint. Now request goes to the browser and it goes to the IDP, foo IDP. So there is no surprise, right? This is the selection user did, right? So now user is on foo IDP's login page. So after completing the login flow, foo IDP will once again redirect the user back to the client application. So here the authorization code will flow to the browser to the client application, right? Then the client application gets a code from the foo IDP, but client application thinks it got the code from evil IDP, right? So then client application will talk to the evil IDP's token endpoint to exchange this code to an access token, right? Then evil IDP at that point will get hold of the authorization code. Now, once you have the authorization code, and if you know the client ID and client secret, evil IDP can exchange this code to an access token and access a resource on behalf of the victim, right? So then again, even if you use authorization code grant type, use of client ID and client secret both is not a must. Many single page applications, they just use client ID. Like most of the public clients, they use client ID and it's public too. So evil IDP can get to know the client ID of the application. Now it has a code, so it can exchange that code to an access token. So this is how the IDP mix-up attack happens. So how do we prevent this? To prevent this, so there's a straightforward approach. If your application works with multiple identity providers, then for each application, you can register a different callback URL or a different redirect URL. For example, for the foo IDP, the callback URL could be the client app /foo. For the evil IDP, the callback URL could be client application / or the client app / evil, right? So now when in step 3, right? So step 3, the client application still thinks it's working with evil IDP, right? Because attacker changed the user's login option. So now it will set the location header to evil IDP's authorization code. At the same time, it will add a parameter value to the user's browser session saying, I am working with this particular IDP, it's evil IDP, right? Now you get redirected here, authenticate the user. In step 5, you issue the code and you get the code here to the callback URL client app /foo, right? So now you are on foo the redirect URL belong to the foo app, right? Then it has to check whether it has checked the value it added to the session in step 3. Now the value the client app added to the session is evil IDP, but now you are on the callback URL of the foo IDP, and the client app can reject the request. Right? So that is how you can prevent your application from the IDP mix-up attack. So if you have multiple IDPs for login, you can use multiple callback URLs. Right? Even if you use TLS here, you should follow this approach. let's go through another attack, cross-site request forgery attack. So here, this is how it takes place. So you have an ID provider. So this can be Facebook, any public IDP. So both the attacker and victim can have accounts in the IDP, right? Then first what the attacker will do is, so attacker will log into the IDP and will get an access token. Sorry, will get an authorization code, right? So you go to the application, application will redirect to the IDP, IDP will authenticate the attacker, and then IDP will send a code through the browser to the client app. The attacker here will block this request, right? So it will block the code going to the client application and will copy that particular URL along with the authorization code, right? So you have the callback URL and the authorization code, you copy everything, and then you somehow post that or send that link along with the code to the victim. So you can email it, or somehow you will let the victim click on that link, right? Then again, the code generated by the IDP in this flow, the client app has never seen up to now, right? So now victim clicks on that link, right? Then it will take the victim to the client application, because that's the callback URL pointing to the client application. So the victim will go to the client application with the authorization code generated under the attacker's account, right? Then the auth client app gets the authorization code, will talk to the token endpoint of the IDP, and will exchange that to a token, right? So then this token reflects the attacker's account. Now the victim has logged into the client application under the attacker's account. So if victim updates or adds his credit card details or places an order, everything is visible to the attacker. So attacker can log in to the client application with his legitimate account and see everything, right? So this is how the CSRF attack works. How do we prevent this? To prevent this, you must use a state parameter, right? The way it happens is, when the client application initiates the first request here, right? The attacker comes to the browser, gets redirected to the client application. Then client application in step 3 redirects the user to the IDP. In step 3, before you redirect the user to the IDP, the client app will generate a random number or random value and add that random value to the user's browser, in this case to the attacker's browser session, and also will add that value to the state parameter and will pass that state parameter to the IDP. Then the IDP will authenticate the user and send back both the state parameter and code. So attacker blocks this request, will copy the entire thing. So the entire URL will have the state parameter and also the code. And in step 5, attacker will pass that to the victim. Victim clicks on that. Now that request goes to the OAuth application. It includes the authorization code and the state parameter. Now the client application has to extract out that state parameter which goes in the request and see whether it can see the same value in the user's browser, in the user's browser session. In this case, it's the victim's browser session, but you don't see that state parameter in the user's the victim's browser session. So the client application can reject the request. So that's how you prevent the CSRF attack using the state parameter. That's why you must use the state parameter. So there are other options like for example, PKCE or PXE, proof key for code exchange profile in OAuth. You can use the same to prevent these type of attacks. So once again, PXE was initially developed to protect code interception attacks in native apps, but it's recommended to use for any app today, right? So ideally, if you use authorization code grant type today, you must use PXE. Okay, so now let's move on to the implicit grant types. Then again, so I'll talk about implicit grant type here and explain how it works, but this is something you must not use. Implicit grant type has its own security issues, so you should not use implicit grant type today for any apps. So some time back, people used implicit grant type for single page applications, but a couple of years back, OAuth working group officially announced you must not use implicit grant type, right? This is how it works. You go to the client application, and the client application will redirect you to the authorization server, just like it did under the authorization grant type, authorization code grant type. Now in step 2, the authorization server will get the consent from the resource owner, and step 3, you will directly issue an access token to the client application. There are no two phases. In the first response itself, coming from the authorization server, it will send an access token to the OAuth client. Now this access token goes in the URI fragment, right? So beauty of this URI fragment is, if you send anything in the URI fragment to the browser, it will remain in the browser's location bar. Browser won't send that to the particular web app, right? So if you go to the next one, the sequence diagram, it will be much clearer, right? So here you go to from the browser. When you do a click on login, it will go to the web server behind that particular application. That will do a redirect to the authorization server. Here you need to set response type as token. So that means if you set response type as token and pass it to authorized endpoint, you expect a token, not a code, right? So you get a token here. So token comes as a URI fragment. Since this comes in a URI fragment, it will remain here on the browser. It won't go to the client, right? So the client backend or to the web server. Then what happens is the web server will respond back with a 200 with a JavaScript, right? So now you have the URI fragment in the browser location bar, and you have JavaScript. So this JavaScript will extract out the access token from the URI fragment, and we'll use that to invoke API. So that's how the implicit grant type works. Now, what are the issues here? One issue is, since we have the access token in the URI fragment, which is in the browser address bar, it will go into the history of the browser. So anyone having access to the history of the browser can see it. The other issue is, since you pass this in the browser address bar in the URL itself, sometimes these things can be logged into the audit logs. The most critical issue is when you invoke an external API from your application, from your JavaScript, when you click that link, what is in the location header, what is in the location bar of the browser will go as a referrer header to the external application. Right? Since the access token is in a URI fragment, that will also get added to the referrer header, so the external parties can discover what your access token is. So that's why you must not use implicit grant type for any sort of applications today. So then, if you don't use implicit grant type for single page application, how should you do that, right? How should you secure the single page apps? You should use authorization code grant type without a client secret. And next week we'll talk about how to secure your single page applications with OpenID. Okay? Then the other grant type is client credentials grant type. So this is mostly used when you have a system tries to access an API. And there's no delegation use case here. Only three parties: authorization server, resource server, client, OAuth client, no resource owner here, right? Or else you can think both the client application and the resource owner are the same. So the way it happens is the client has its own credentials. It can be client ID, client secret, or even it can use mutual certificates. And then you can authenticate to the authorization server. The client can authenticate to the authorization server with its own client credentials. Once the authentication is done, the client will issue an access token. So there's no browser here. The client got the access token, and then client can use that access token to access an API hosted in the OAuth resource server. Right? So that's how the client credentials grant type works. Yeah. So this is a sequence diagram. So the client directly talks to the token endpoint of the authorization server and then get the token. Remember, so there's no authorized endpoint, so no response type here. So the request goes directly from client to the token endpoint. So here we use client credentials as the grant type. Okay, there's a question or a comment. Yeah. So that is why there's a fragment to this Zoom meeting invite. I was wondering. That's that. Yes. Yeah. So basically, I haven't explored in detail how the Zoom is using that. So the password is sent as a URI fragment, which will stay on the browser. It won't leave the browser, right? It won't go to the Zoom web server. So probably Zoom is like using some JavaScript there to extract out the passcode and talk to Zoom's APIs. Then the password grant type, this is also something you should avoid using, right? The way it happens is the resource owner gives his credentials directly to the client application. Then the client application will do a request, a direct request, no browser, to the authorization server, passing the client's own credentials as well as the end user's credentials. Then the authorization server will validate that and then issue a token. Then the client can use that token to access the APIs. So this is the exact problem OAuth wanted to solve in first place. So then why this is in the OAuth specification? The reason OAuth introduced this grant type to the OAuth RFC is to help the client applications which were using basic authentication to migrate to the OAuth specification, right? So if they are, if that application still accepting username and password from users, they can keep doing that, but they don't need to remember that. They don't need to store the username and password in their client side. They can simply exchange that to a token and store the token and use that token to access the resources which are provided with OAuth. So at the resource side, you don't need to worry about the grant type. It simply expect a token, right? You can get the token following any grant type. What matters to the resource server or the API is the token, right? That's it. Yeah, so this is quite straightforward. You just do a post from the client to the authorization server's token endpoint, passing the client ID, client secret, and also username and password of the user. And you need to set the grant type as password, then you'll get a token back. Couple of things. We didn't talk about refresh tokens under other grant types. So in authorization code grant type, you will get a refresh token. But in implicit grant type, you won't get a refresh token, right? In password grant type, you will get a refresh token. In client credential grant type, you won't get a refresh token because you don't need a refresh token in client credential grant type, right? Because the client always knows the credentials. If the token expires, it can use its own credentials and get a new access token. You don't need to have a refresh token. But in password grant type, you will see a refresh token. So you don't need to keep asking username and password from the end user whenever your token expires. Okay, so we talked about grant types as an extension point in OAuth 2.0. You can define your own grant types. At a high level, a grant type defines how to get an access token from an authorization server to access a resource on behalf of a user, right? It basically defines that particular protocol. There are 4 grant types in the OAuth specification, and there are some other custom grant types too. Some grant types defined outside the OAuth RFC. Then again, you can create your own custom grant types as well. Scopes we discussed. So scope is basically the purpose of the access token. So whenever you request an access token from the authorization server, you need to specify the purpose of the scope, and a given access token is attached to a scope, right? Then token types. Most of the OAuth implementations today, they use bearer token types. So bearer token is like cash. So if I steal $10 from you, I can use it at any Starbucks to buy a coffee, right? So no one will question like whether I own that $10 or not. The bearer tokens are similar to that. If someone steals a bearer token, they can use it anywhere. So if someone steals your access token, they can use it anywhere to access an API. There's no additional checks. So that's the security risk. So that's why you must use TLS to protect all the communication channels that you use. Also, in addition to TLS, you can also enforce MTLS between the client application and your resource server, the gateway. So then, even if you steal an access token, you cannot, like from the outside, ignore the same APIs, because the API gateway will also authenticate the client, right? So in addition to the bearer token type, so there's another token type called MAC token. So this is in very early stage. There's no like active development happening under the MAC token profile in OAuth. But the way you can think of token types is another extension point in OAuth 2.0 profile, OAuth 2.0 RFC. Then the client types. So there are 2 client types in OAuth 2.0. One client type is called confidential client type. The other one is public clients. The confidential clients are capable of keeping their secret securely. Like, so they know, or they can secure the client secret, they can secure the access token, refresh token, those stuff. So typically a web application, we can treat as a confidential client. But if you take a single page app always runs on the browser. So anything in the browser, the end user can see. So those applications cannot securely store any credential. So those are called public clients. Same for the native mobile apps. You cannot store anything securely in a native mobile app. You can hide it, you can make it harder, but still, if someone having access to like root level access to the mobile device can discover all those keys. So native app, SPA, all are known as public clients, right? So if you are using authorization code grant type with public clients, you should not use the authorization, the client secret. You can use it, but it's meaningless. Ideally, you should avoid using the client secret, just use the client ID. Okay. So OpenID Connect, we are not going into the details as we are running out of time. So we'll have another session, probably next session. We'll talk about both the single page app and OpenID Connect both. So at a high level, so OpenID Connect is an identity layer built on top of OAuth2 protocol. It uses the same OAuth flow, and it defines some additional steps too. So this is how OpenID Connect works at a high level. I won't go to details, but in next meetup, we will cover all OpenID Connect flows in detail. So here the same authorization code grant type. One thing to notice is in request 1, if you want to use OpenID Connect or OAuth2, you must send OpenID as the scope. You can add additional scopes too, but you must have the value OpenID, right? So then authorization server knows this is an OpenID request, issues the authorization code here. Then when you exchange the authorization code to an access token, in addition to the access token, you will also get something called ID token. So ID token is a JWT. So we discussed about JWT in our very first meetup. So it's in fact a JWS, or it can be a JWE as well. So this particular ID token carries the assertions about the end user, right? So just looking at the ID token, the client application can find out who the end user is. Okay. So then the client application can use ID token to authenticate the user, and it can use the access token to access the API secret OAuth2 on behalf of the end user. So then again, like this particular access token you get from the authorization server, it can be a reference token or else a self-contained token, right? So if it is a reference token, when the client application uses that token in step 6, to validate a reference token, resource server always must talk to the authorization server, because the reference token is just a string. But if it's a self-contained access token, which is JWT, when in step 6, when you get the JWT, the self-contained access token, resource server doesn't need to talk to the authorization server. It can simply validate the signature and find out the scopes, the client ID, the subject, everything in the JWT itself. Now, there's an argument. If you can use self-contained access tokens with OAuth2, in other words, if this access token itself is a JWT, why do we need to have another token called ID token which carries user claims? Why don't you embed the same set of claims to the access token and use just a single token, right? So there's a major difference between an ID token and access token. Yes, like practically you can do anything, but in theory, in practice by design, the audience of the access token, whether it's a JWT or not, is the resource server or the APIs. But the audience of the ID token is the client, right? You don't need to embed all the claims that client needs also in the access token, right? Those may not be visible to the resource server. You don't need to explicitly embed everything that you embed in ID token to the access token. So that's the main difference. Okay, so this is a custom grant type, or a grant type that is outside the OAuth RFC. There's an RFC for this one too. The way it works is you log into a web application with a SAML service provider with a SAML IDP. Now what you have at the web app is a SAML token. Right? You don't have users credentials. You don't know users credentials. So you cannot use any of the other OAuth grant types. But now the application wants to access an API on behalf of the end user. You only have the SAML token to represent the end user. Then what you can do is you can use SAML grant type for OAuth2, talk to the token endpoint of the authorization server, pass a SAML token, and the authorization server will validate the SAML token. It it will validate the signature of the SAML token. To do that, it has to trust the issuer or the IDP. If the trust is there, it will validate the token and then will issue an access token. Then number 6 is same for any grant types. You get the access token. Then the resource server will talk to the server to validate it. Now you will know all the details corresponding to that access. So you will know the client application, user, scopes, everything, right? Then if you use OpenID Connect, so there's a typo here. It has to be OpenID Connect application. Then instead of a SAML token, what you get is a JWT, the ID token. Here you can exchange that ID token or JWT to an access token, then use that access token to access a resource. So one change here is you cannot exchange any JWT you get here to an access token, right? Because in a JWT or ID token, it has an audience, right? So typically in OpenID Connect flow, what you get as audience is a JWT is a client ID, right? So if you try to exchange that to an access token, it will fail here because the audience value doesn't contain an identifier which points to the authorized server. So if you want to use JWT grant type, then you also need to inform IDP to add the audience value of the authorized server to the audience parameter of the JWT or the ID token. Otherwise, it will get rejected from the authorized server. Same applies to SAML as well. Okay, so that's what I plan to cover. If you have any questions, we can take them now. You can either unmute and speak up, or else you can type them in the Zoom chat. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, okay, so that seems to be a question. Also, like if you go to Meetup site, we have a link to a Slack channel, IAM for Developers Slack channel. So please subscribe to that, sign up for that Slack channel, then you can ask any questions there too. Okay, so there's a question. Any chance you can cover the device flow grant type possibly in few? Yeah, we can discuss device flow grant type too. So basically, device flow grant type is designed for applications which are not capable of using a browser, right, to get the token. So for example, if you have a smart TV or any device which is not capable of spinning up a browser to complete this flow, then a device grant type is designed for that. So we'll talk about device grant types in the later meetup. Okay, so there's a question. Why 2 codes? Why not access token only? A very good question. Actually, I want to cover that. Somehow I forgot it. So if you go here, if you go to the first diagram, which talks about the authorization code grant type. Right? So why do we need to send this temporary code here, right? As a browser read rate. Why can't the authorized server directly send an access token to an endpoint in the OAuth client application, right? The reason is, if you directly send an access token to an endpoint in the client application cannot bind the front channel communication with the back channel communication, right? So let me explain that. So let's say you visit an application, let's say it's Amazon, right? So you are not logged in, but you keep adding some like items to your shopping cart, right? Then the way Amazon tracks or any like shopping cart application tracks is, if you are not logged in, whatever the items you added to that shopping cart will be in your browser session, right? Now you click on login. So when you click on login, you will be redirected to the IDP, right? Then if IDP sends a code directly to a back channel endpoint of the application, it sends a token, right? Now you get an isolated token here. Application doesn't know how to map that token to the front channel, right? So if you want to do that, probably what you can do is in the request itself, you can send some session identifier. Then the authorized server will send the token along the session identifier to the back channel endpoint of the client application, but that won't work. That's a security issue, right? Sharing a session identifiers with a third-party IDP. But if you use code, what happens is you have the browser session, then you get redirected to the client application with the code. Then you are on the client application, then you will, the browser, go back here. So you are here, right? You are here. Now you have the browser session, and the browser will do a get to the client application along with the code, right? So in this request, you will also get the cookies associated with the particular domain, right? The client domain. Then you have the cookies, which you can use to code at the session. You get the code, then you can attach the code to the browser session, right? So now you exchange that code to a token. Now you can attach this token to your current browser session. So you can keep whatever things you had in the shopping cart as a logged in user too, right? So basically the purpose is to correlate your front channel with the back channel. That's why you see this, the intermediate code. Okay. It's another question. It needs a redirect URL. That's why we need two codes. The first code is the original client. Okay. Yeah. So if you don't have any questions, thanks a lot for joining, and hope you will join the next meetup in next week, where we are going to talk about how to use OpenID Connect to secure single page applications. Then again, thank you very much for joining, and stay safe. Thank you.